The focus of this short talk is the parables of Jesus in the Gospel according to Luke. Luke reports 30 or more parables, the most of any of the New Testament Gospels, and of them about half appear only in Luke. Well, Luke is outstanding not only in the number of parables of Jesus, but also in their beauty, their literary artistry. Some of the most memorable teachings of Jesus, the prodigal son, the father and his two sons, the Good Samaritan. Some of the most memorable teachings of Jesus are parables that appear only in the Gospel according to Luke. What is a parable? Well, Jesus was not the only Jewish teacher, the only philosopher, teacher to tell parables. A parable is a short story, a short narrative. The Greek word is parabole. It's a narrative set alongside life or an understanding of God that helps us to understand that reality more clearly. One of the most famous definitions of the parable, I'm going to adapt it a little bit, comes from C.H. Dodd more than a half century ago. Dodd, thinking of the New Testament parables, thinking of Jesus' parables, said that a parable is a metaphor, I'll say a short story, drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearer by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about its precise application to tease it into active thought. And that's just what the parables of Jesus are doing in the Gospels. They invite us listeners, they invite us readers to imagine that world that Jesus is creating in this short story, and to ask ourselves, what is he saying? What does it mean? What does it ask of us? Well, we will not take time to look at all of the parables of Jesus in Luke, but what I want to do is focus on a couple of aspects of them that are really quite striking. Ways in which Jesus tells parables in Luke that are open-ended, that draw readers into the story to supply a conclusion. And the second is what we call interior monologues, speech of characters. Jesus in Luke will, in his parables, sometimes take us inside the thoughts of the key characters. And that also draws us readers in to imagine ourselves in the story and to ask ourselves how we would respond. What would we decide? What would we do? I want to illustrate the point about open-ended stories in the parables by looking at a couple of cases outside parables in Luke's narrative. One is the story of the rich man who comes to Jesus. He's on a quest for eternal life, and he wants to know what he should do. And Jesus challenges the man to give up all his wealth, to make that available for the needs of the poor, and to come and follow Jesus. Now, in Mark's version of the story, the rich man goes away sorrowful, because indeed he was very rich and could not let go of his wealth. But the way Luke tells the story, the rich man doesn't go away. He's presumably still there listening as Jesus goes on to teach the disciples about what he means, and he talks about how hard it is to get into the kingdom of heaven with wealth. It's harder than a camel going through a needle's eye. But he goes on to say, Jesus goes on to say, that with God, things are possible that are not possible with human beings. And that holds out to us the possibility that for this rich man too, there is hope. So an open-ended story, and we readers have to work to think about where the story goes next. The other example that I wanted to point to is a story in Luke 7, where a Pharisee named Simon hosts Jesus in a dinner, and a woman bursts in uninvited. Jesus defends the woman's honor, challenges his Pharisee host because he's so critical of the woman, tells a parable about a large debt forgiven, a small debt forgiven, and asks Simon, well, who's going to love more, the one forgiven the larger debt or the smaller debt? And Simon knows the answer to that. The one forgiven more will love more. But the story ends with us not knowing whether Simon, the Pharisee host, will be convinced by what Jesus has said. Will he open his arms? Will he accept Jesus' embrace of a sinful woman? So those are examples of this pattern. In several of the parables we see it. The best known probably of Jesus' parables, it's in Luke 15, verses 11 through 32, the father with two sons, the prodigal son who goes off and squanders everything, but that older son who remains home and is lost at home as well. The father receives back his returning prodigal son and has a great banquet, a great feast. The whole community gathers except for the older brother. He's out in the field working as always. He comes in, finds out what's going on, and he's outraged. Well, Jesus leaves us wondering at the end of the parable, will the older brother swallow his pride and his resentment and go in and join the feast? We readers are left wondering, as we look at Jesus' acceptance of the outsiders, of the lost, of sinners, will we be able to join the feast alongside them? Another good example is a rich farmer has an abundant harvest. It's a great crop, bumper crop. And he wonders what he ought to do. His barns aren't big enough to store it all. So he says, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, I'll build bigger ones so I can store it all and I can sit back and enjoy my abundance. And Jesus says, God interrupts that speech. Tonight, your soul, your life will be asked of you, be demanded of you. But we don't know what happens that night. And does the rich farmer change his tune? So we imagine ourselves in the story. What would we do if we had such wealth? Would we hoard it to ourselves? Would we find a way of sharing it generously with others? Is it all about me? Or is it about what's been entrusted to me for us? Another good example, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. The lawyer comes to Jesus to test him. And they both know what the commands of the Torah, the law of Moses, are. And so there's the rich the lawyer knowing that the law of God calls for us to love God with our whole being and to love neighbor as self, but he's wanting to put Jesus on the spot to trap him, and so he says, but who is my neighbor? That sets the stage for Jesus to tell the story about the Samaritan, so a despised outsider who shows us what it means to be a neighbor to someone who falls by the wayside and is in great need, one beaten by robbers. At the end of the story, which one proved neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? The lawyer knows. It's the one who showed mercy. So Jesus says, you go and do likewise. But the story ends there, and we don't know what the lawyer's takeaway is, what his response will be. We readers are encouraged to place ourselves in the story and to ask, what would we do? Will we go and do likewise? Will we show mercy to a despised outsider? And then finally, there's the rich man and poor man in Luke 16, verses 19 through 31. There's no hope for the rich man in the story. He's neglected the needs of the poor beggar Lazarus, and his life is over. It's too late for him. But there are those 5 brothers of his back home. It's not too late for them, or is it? The story is left, we're left at the end of the story wondering, will they reform? Will they change their lives? But then that puts the question to us, what about us? What will we choose? What will we decide to do? Will we be prompted to move to compassion, to generosity? So, ways in which Luke's parables draw us into the story and put a question to us. How will we choose? What will we do? How will we live? Same thing happens now with these interior monologues. I'll just point to a couple of them. So speech of characters within parables. We already saw one of them, where the rich farmer said, well, what shall I do with this bumper crop? And rather than thinking about the needs of a community, he thinks only about his own prosperity and his own leisure, his own comfort. But the other two examples I wanted to point to, one is about a very interesting character, a manager, a steward in Luke 16. He's in charge of a rich man's estate, but he's found squandering his master's, his owner's, his boss's property. So he's fired, and then he faces the dilemma. Again, what will I do? And what he chooses to do is just the opposite of what the rich farmer did. Rather than isolate himself from community and hoard up his wealth for himself, he builds a network of friends. He goes out, he finds his boss's debtors, and he sits down with them and reduces their debts. Now, there's a lot of intrigue about this, and it's all a little bit suspicious. This is a bit of a rogue character. So he's not exemplary, he's not a model in all respects. But what he does with wealth, which passes, which is not permanent, is to build a network of friendship. So it puts the question to us as we think about what he chose, puts the question to us, what will we do with the wealth that's entrusted to us by God, with the resources that we have? Will we also build a network of friends by sharing generously what's been entrusted to us? Final example is another very strange character. It's the judge in Luke 18, verses 1 through 8. Now, this is a contemptuous judge who has no respect for God or for other people. The narrator tells us, Jesus tells us, and he tells us himself. The widow, whose case he refuses to hear, keeps coming back, insisting on justice. And so finally the judge says, what am I going to do? I know what I'll do. I'll give her justice just to get her out of my courtroom. So it puts the question to us, how would we choose? What would we decide? What would we do faced with the need for justice? Would we stand with a vulnerable widow who's been wronged? And would we act decisively? So these are some examples of parables in Luke that draw us readers in, either with open-ended endings or giving us a taste of what the thinking, the thought process of the characters is, and that invites us readers into the story and puts a question to us about our own lives. How will we respond to this vision of God's work, God's grace, God's open embrace of outsiders, of all the wrong people, and God's insistence on justice for those who've been wronged? How will we respond to that vision? Will we say yes? And will we act in our own situations in life as the parable challenges us to?